Let's just crack on with it. My name is Thomas Wilson. I work at Privitar. We're a data privacy startup, scale-up, just based near Blackfriars. And today we're going to be talking about how we've brought ReactJS from front to back, so how we've brought it, how we've created full stack teams at Privitar. So first of all, let's chat a little bit about me, which is also my expert subject. So on Twitter, I'm at TJWilson92, give me a follow. I'm a front-end developer over at Privitar using TypeScript and React. I'm a UX and UI design enthusiast, so we'll get to this a little bit later, but I'm really interested in this, this front-of-the-front concept, so UX engineering is something I find really interesting. I come from an educational technology background, which will become apparent very quickly. I'm a dancer and producer for a local contemporary dance theatre company. We're called Canal Dance Co. I'm a cyclist. I love coffee, Indian food, and loose leaf tea, and I'm a list enthusiast. That was the first of many lists we're going to see tonight, so buckle up. What are we going to talk about? We're going to be having a look at, first of all, working in data privacy and how we create privacy-enhancing technologies. We're going to look at how we create a full-stack team and kind of what that means. And then lastly, we're going to be looking at conversations you should be having as kind of the more experienced React and JavaScript developers if you start working with people who are maybe a bit newer to the community and the ecosystem. I lied, this is the last point. Then we're going to be looking at some guidelines and resources for how we have those conversations and how we do that training. So let's take a brief little foray into privacy-enhancing technologies. Has anyone heard of privacy-enhancing technologies before? Oh, you guys are in for a treat. That's so fun. So privacy-enhancing technologies are super interesting for a couple of reasons. So recently there's been a whole bunch of corporate, legal, and social pressure for data privacy for you guys. Don't know how many of you know this, but there's a whole bunch of data out there floating around about you that people know. And only recently have ad tech companies had to kind of fess up to the ethically questionable things they've been doing with your data. And so all this pressure now with things like GDPR in Europe and America are really pushing this whole right to be forgotten. There's a lot more awareness of where your data is and how it's being used and how you as the people who are the source of that data, you have a right to understand what that data is and where it is. But at some point, these wonderful ethical ideas, which we all agree with, have got to come down to like real people sitting in front of real computers using it on real data on like a Wednesday afternoon. There's a gap there between I have this wonderful idea, I'm a lawmaker, to I work at a bank and I've got to make sure my data is legally compliant. And because it's so new, there's no visual, there's no syntactic vocabulary that exists yet to explain these concepts, and they're very difficult concepts to explain, which is why privacy-enhancing technology is a really interesting area to be working in because it's so new. So briefly, a little bit about Privitar. I'll keep it very short. So we are an enterprise software company. There's no consultancy, it's all enterprise-level software. And we are actively involved in the research and policy space. So we have a lot of ties with academia. We have recently been involved with the government writing a chapter for the Office of National Statistics on differential privacy, which you can chat to me about if you want. But we really believe in the things that we say and the maths behind it and the rigor behind it. It's not just about selling software for us, it's about really pushing the zero data privacy, and we all care very deeply about it. So we understand it deeply, we care about it deeply. So let's imagine that we are this cloud at the top, and we are a payments provider company, and we specialize in kind of transient retailers. So maybe people who own those pop-up coffee stores, or people who own pop-up physical stores, and you own these little plastic chips. You've been there, I've been there, we've all seen them, we've all bought coffee with them, and you as the cloud have a whole bunch of rows in a database essentially about transactions, and through that we can kind of identify individuals through their credit card numbers. Obviously, people might use different credit cards at different points, but we can probably bring in some data from other third-party sources and start to get a good idea about who owns what cards, and if the same different cards are owned by the same person, and maybe what demographic that person's in. So there's a lot we can start to identify about this data, and therefore there's a lot of value we can provide with this data. So let's pretend that I run this coffee stall, and I want to know if my customers are often return customers or if they're new customers. So is the same person coming in every Tuesday to buy the same flat white at 8:33 p.m., for example, or is it someone new all the time? Because I can get a lot of value from that. I can understand how I'm marketing, I can consider my next marketing move, I can look at loyalty programs. It's good for me as a business to have that data. The data privacy and the data privacy protection here is the cloud provider, cannot just send an Excel file off with a whole bunch of rows with credit card numbers in. That's just incredibly unethical. So it's about understanding how that data needs to be transformed for me to be able to provide the right level of information from the data, but also protect the people at the root of the data, which is you guys using your credit cards to buy coffee. So in this instance, that's one instance of it. Another more sensitive instance is looking at healthcare. So let's imagine that we're doing some public health policy, and we want to look at how hospital data, how GP data, and how some digital health data, so that Strava and Fitbit, just for clarity, they're not our customers, they're just examples. They might collect things like heart rate continuously throughout a day or do some physical exercise. And obviously that's potentially very deeply personally invasive data to have about someone, but it's very important from a health perspective. So controlling who has access to which parts of that data is very important. Understanding if a GP doesn't need to see your past 30 days of activity on Strava, for example, it's completely irrelevant, but they might need to see if you've been in hospital in the past 30 days. That could be much more relevant to what you're talking to them about. So data privacy can be about aggregating and transforming data. It can also be just about restricting who has access to what data, and if they can access it, what form is it in. Enough about privacy enhanced technologies. Let's look at the full stack trademark teams and what it means. So when we think about the development stack, we have these wonderful ideas about being a full stack developer, and then there was this piece about the myth of the full stack developer, and then there was this other really great piece called the myth of the full stack developer, and now we've got this idea of kind of T-shaped developers. And the point I want to get here is that people are just going to learn whatever they find interesting and whatever lets them get the job done. Some people, for some reason, take a lot of pleasure in telling you that you can't be a full stack developer. There's no way someone could possibly understand a server and a client. It cannot be done. It's a very interesting opinion to have and not one that I share. But recently, there's been this idea of a T-shaped developer. So if you're working in the web, which you probably are, I hope you are, you will have this widespread knowledge, but you might have the bit where you go particularly deep. So that might be on, I really understand SVG transformations and animations. Cool. That's the base of the T. That's your descender. It might be that you really care about how you reverse proxy through Nginx. Great. Allowing people to have that full stack understanding and pick their own area of expertise that helps them and helps their businesses is really important and really interesting within the web community. And I think it's quite unique to us, and I really celebrate that because I love knowing a little bit about a lot. It suits my personality type really well. So having a full stack team is really important in terms of sharing knowledge of concepts. So I might understand differential privacy really well from a very conceptual standpoint, but my understanding of it remains conceptual compared to the people that I work with wrote the algorithms that do the transformations. We have that great level of understanding of what should be done and how it's done. Is a really great thing to have within a team. And it also helps remove things like silos or tribes or them. There's no throwing work over a fence. There's no being a bottleneck for someone else. It's working together and seeing we're all just developers. We're all in this together. It also means that you're able to pick up and just to make little changes to a code base here and there, which is so useful because then you're not relying on someone, you're not creating those bottlenecks. And like at Olympia, I learned this today, Java is 24 years old. It is 9 months older than the junior that started and sits opposite me. Java is a very old bit of software. So you work the same for 24 years and still do it, that's very brave. But you also come with a whole bunch of experience about how you actually create enterprise software. So there are systems out there that are probably 24 years old and are still running. Let's see if there's anything React running in 24 years. So you come with that level of experience, you've got an idea of architecture that works, with CI or CD or pipelines, and more recently kind of this cloud infrastructure and services. Obviously that's much newer development, but it comes much more naturally to them. Despite all this sharing and this great progression that we've all made to being full stack developers, a guy called Chris Coyer, a fantastic man of CSS tricks, wrote this article in January of this year about the Great Divide. He runs a podcast called Shop Talk Show, where he's just been speaking to a whole bunch of web developers over the past couple of years. And one of the themes that he saw that kind of emerged through this is that we have the front of the front and the back of the front. So even if we are this T-shaped developer, even there we can find ways to aggregate ourselves and differentiate ourselves and divide ourselves. So we have this strong urge to be other, to be different, to be differentiated. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Because front of the front developers, which is what I personally kind of identify as, is understanding how we design visual interfaces to clearly communicate ideas. It's understanding how we communicate technical ideas. It's understanding how we let users define the things they intended to define. So if I need to tell you the shape of my data, especially if I have things like healthcare data, it's very important that that's free-form data, but I can communicate what I need to communicate through the interface. Whereas back of the front developers are fantastic at kind of getting the software to the clients and understanding how we might manage the software when it's on premises, when it's behind a firewall, how can we debug it, how can we manage it sustainably, how can we authenticate our API calls, all these really important things that absolutely are essential, but I would find incredibly tedious and boring to work through. They I absolutely love. I've spoken a lot about theory, but let's talk about what this actually means. So the point I was trying to get across with all this very well put together, very well elocuted thoughts is that we all have very different skills. And that's fantastic, and we should all be working together because we as a team can move each other forward for the benefit of the business. What does that mean for ReactJS, and what does that mean for bringing on back-end developers or back-of-the-front developers or anyone who hasn't worked in ReactJS? How do we onboard them? Let's start to get stuck in the weeds. So every example I'm going to give is related to Pokemon. It has meant that for the past few days, my search history has been Pokemon things and basic ReactJS questions, which I take great pride from whenever anyone looks over me and I'm just like looking at Pokemon on Wikipedia. So imagine we are a museum and we have fun facts about Aerodactyl. We have 3 fun facts. This is actually a true fun fact. You can fact check me here. And we want to let the user be able to select the fun fact that they want on. When someone comes to implement this in React, they might start asking us the question, why can't I set state directly? When a user clicks fun fact number 2, why cannot I say, that's right, there are animations. Why can't I say this.state.selectedFunFactID is equal to 1? Why does that not work? It's a very interesting question because it would technically work and the state would internally update, but what we wouldn't see is a re-render. Because what we start to see here is that a new object for state isn't created, which means when React comes to diff the state, it's going to return us true and it's going to say the 2 things are equal and they're not equal. It's going to return us a false positive. And that's going to mean it doesn't render because React's very good at knowing when things should or shouldn't render. That's its whole thing. That's what it does for us. So getting someone who might come from a more imperative background, a more kind of getter-setter mindset that things like Java and C# provide us, this is a very intrinsically important thing to understand, a very intrinsically important thing to communicate with the people who are coming onto our team. And sometimes it's not going to be enough, especially for experienced developers, to say, just don't touch state directly, use set state, use these hooks. You want to be able to explain it at this level. Let's imagine they've got another question. Let's say that we are making a website for Professor Oak, and it's just a very simple sort of static site, but we want to provide some kind of analytics to let us know when the page is rendered, because Professor Oak really cares about people seeing his site and wants to be able to count them. So let's say we've got some code, super simple code. We've got a nice little hook up here. I love me a hook. So we just got this little Boolean flag saying, has it loaded? Fun little fact about the fire animation, you can set it to go on for 60 seconds. Can you imagine ever needing a fire animation to last a full minute? Oh, this is such a good presentation. So we've got this here, just imagine it. We've got this here, and this might get us into a little bit of trouble because the JavaScript in the browser kind of runs single-threaded, there are edges to that case. We might end up in a case where every render, a Boolean is set to a value, which causes the render to run again, which causes the value to be set, it's a recursive loop that we can easily get ourselves stuck in because we're invoking a function within the function component itself. And that's when we can start to see our laptop try and take off. That's when we can see something start to burn up. And it might not be immediately obvious when it is something so invisible as setting a Boolean as has loaded, but it can cause us problems. And so here is when this idea that React, everything is just a function. That's the direction we're moving in, or the core team is taking us in, is this idea that everything is just a function that runs, and we can kind of point to a function implication, or we can point to a function reference, and React does its thing. So taking in novice ReactJS developers and novice front-end developers and explaining to this and saying, look, a function is just a component that runs. It just so happens to do this thing on the DOM. That doesn't matter. It is a function that runs, and you are causing it to recursively call itself. That's going to be a massive problem. Let's look at another question that a developer might have. So let's say that we run a Pokemon Academy in Viridian City, and we want to log in. We want to just log in through just a modal. So we've got this beautifully designed homepage. We've got a login button. And we've just got a Boolean flag saying, is this modal visible? Set modal is visible. Use state. Great, fantastic. Why can't I just pass a function invocation to this? Because that's what we do in Angular, I think. That's what we do in Vue. We say on click, set modal is visible to true, because that's what we want. On the click, that happens. What actually happens under the hood here, and what isn't intuitive to understand, is that React is looking for what gets evaluated out of that function. So when that function runs, set is modal visible to true, it's going to return us undefined. So what React is saying is on click, do undefined. How do I do undefined? Can't do it. It's not a click handler, doesn't work. Nothing's going to happen when I click that button. So it's taking that again at the fundamental idea of React is that everything is a function, yes, but sometimes we want to just have a reference to the function, so I can decide when I call it. It's not up to you, the author, to tell me when to call things. React will tell you when I want to call them. And it's that idea of passing, oh, I forgot. We have an animation. Look at that. We're passing control over to React, which leads me to my last question, which is, why is this not imperative? Why can't I tell React, do these things in this order, in this way, please? So let's imagine that you own Kanto radio station, and you have 3 radio stations, and whenever someone selects the station they want to listen to, you just want to let them know what time they started listening, because maybe they really care about that. Last animation of the day, guys. Oh, so good. So we've got this use effect hook. Who doesn't love? Are we all using hooks, by the way? Am I speaking French? There was wild nods. I saw at least a couple of nods. Hooks are pretty cool. They're a new part of React. They're more declarative. By declarative, I mean we just tell React, here's what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. So in this instance, we're saying, look at the currently playing. I've misnamed it. There's a typo. There's a code error. So what we should be doing is say, look at the start time, and whenever that changes, run this function. It stops you having to manually set up maybe an on-event listener and then removing that on-event listener to the browser. React handles everything inside of us, everything inside of the browser for us. We're just saying, do this when this happens. It's going to happen asynchronously because you're a browser, you're inherently asynchronous. Passing that control over is very difficult. It's a very big conceptual gap to make, and it's one that I had a lot of fun explaining because it comes very slowly, because it crops up in different places, especially where we are with the React ecosystem, and the React core team, core library even, where things are moving over slightly to this, and it's not yet a perfect transition. And obviously with legacy code bases, you're still going to have class components, so it's about understanding where and when this applies. There are a bunch of other questions I think that we need to expect, and we as experts need to be prepared to have, so you need to have answers to these questions, or at least know where to point people. The first one is, where is the rest of the framework? People keep telling me React is a framework. React is not a framework, React is UI library. Why doesn't it come with routing? Why doesn't it come with state management? It does kind of now come with state management, but why doesn't it come with the things I would expect an application to have? React is just the bit that you see. There's a whole bunch of other things that are probably in your application. And you can, in fact, get frameworks, things like Gatsby and Next, that provide us this idea of routing and opinionated ways to do things. But a lot of the time, it kind of comes down to us to have these conversations. Something else I've had a lot of people ask me is, I heard we should be using Redux. This is a very nuanced conversation to have with someone, especially if they're just coming to JavaScript, and React even, because there's a lot of literature out there saying why Redux is a really good thing to be using, why it is kind of the state management du jour. And there are cases where it is appropriate, because it does a lot of really fantastic things, and because it's so mature, it has a great ecosystem around it. What it also has is a lot of boilerplate and a lot of mental gymnastics at the beginning to understand what's going on and why. And it explains to people that now we've got better solutions with things like React Native Context API. We can perhaps do things with React, just React, without having to reach out for something like Redux or Mobex right now. Having that conversation is a very difficult one, because there's a lot of evidence telling you you're wrong in the big literature. What should we test? Again, I don't know, whatever you want to test, really. There's no guidance here. Should we be testing what a component renders out? Because arguably that's all a user cares about, is what does my page look like? I don't need to test the internal logic. As long as I click a button and something happens, that's all I need to test. That is a perfectly valid argument to have. That reduces your test coverage surface, but it also reduces it only to the things that are visible. Have the conversation with your team. Why can't I just do this in CSS? So if someone comes from a more typical web development background, they might look at something like style components and just not understand why someone would do this to themselves or to the world at large, which is often counteracted by this other question I get, is why do I have to use CSS? So people that come from, especially who have come from a Java background, they may have seen some legacy CSS which is horrible, and they associate CSS with these single massive files where everything is bang important and just horribly architected, not well understood. And now we've obviously got a lot more understanding about CSS. We can have CSS modules and scope CSS. There's a lot of great things we can do with it now that we couldn't do before, but some people haven't seen that and don't understand that yet, and that's something that I take great pleasure in discussing with people. The last question is related to React, but also to the world at large. Why is everyone on Twitter so angry with each other? I don't know, guys. Why is everyone on Twitter so angry at each other? Everyone has a lot of opinions. Everyone likes to have a hot take around the JavaScript React community. We really play up to this idea that everything's changing every 7 minutes. It's not. We're pretty good. We're pretty stable. We're pretty clever guys. So when you are new and coming to the community and you reach out and you go, oh, cool, who are the people in the lead of this field? Maybe I should follow them on Twitter because, they'll let me know what's coming up and what might be interesting. No. They're just getting angry at each other. And there's been some big drama recently. Oh, it's completely unnecessary, especially if you're just coming to React and you need to start understanding the things we've just been spoken about. It's very distracting. Expect to answer that question, expect to provide guidance. Questions you will want to expect. These are things I really wish my team asked me about, but they never do. So the first one is literally anything about JSX. JSX is super interesting and really covering what it does because you can put it in a JavaScript file. It's not valid JavaScript, but it still gives you, it compiles down for you. And it looks like HTML, but it's not HTML, but it gets there. And we've got these reserved words like class and class name that we can't, very interesting design questions and architecture questions that no one wants to speak to me about. And I had to read a lot about in case someone had like a really tiny question about it. Nope, they just got it because it looks so much like HTML. They get it, they write it, they move on. No questions for me. We have lifecycle methods. Because we started working just after the hooks API got released, we were very fortunate that a lot of our code base is kind of hooks from day zero, which has been fantastic. So I spent a lot of my time learning about lifecycle hooks when I was coming into React, obviously, and then now no one wants to talk about them anymore. And it means that people don't have perhaps as good an understanding of the lifecycle of a component, which arguably is bad, but because they're kind of now hidden and abstracted away behind these declarative ideas, they just don't get given to us. And cross-browser compatibility. This is not a solved problem, I'm not claiming that, but because things like Babel now come built into so many of like Create React App and all these things, we can compile things down to at least go down to like IE11, and what's that, like 98-99% of our browser use cases. We can reach 99% of our browsers, our users, without doing a single thing. It just happens, it just builds for us. Very few people care about reaching that extra 1 or 2%. Very few people should care about reaching that 1 or 2% because it is only 1 or 2%, like direct your resources. When you're having these discussions, or you're forcing people to recognize how cool JSX is, when you're doing that, there's a couple of things you need to be aware of. You need to make sure that things work for your team, you need to make them work for your project, and they work for your company. There are no right answers, or else we wouldn't be in this mess. We're in this mess. So keep making different opinions, keep figuring out who you're working with. When you're working with Java developers, maybe use things that are more familiar to the getter-setter mindset. Maybe use things that are more imperative, because it will make them more productive, and because the context switching of going from one framework to the other will be reduced, they can continue to be a more productive full stack team member. And you as a team can continue to move forward, to iterate faster, to do all these wonderful things that you as your company need. And then you can go home in your evening, you can write these weird hooks that no one will ever use on your NPM package that no one downloads, and you can just take great joy in it. But at work, these are the way we need to be having conversations. So how do we structure good conversations? This is I wouldn't say a deep cut Friends reference, but it's definitely a very specific Friends reference. I don't know if anyone's seen this episode of Friends. If you have, it's a very funny picture. I'm going to talk to you, and I have been talking to you like you are not experts, but you are. And I know that you are, and I know that you know that I know that you are. But we have to talk to each other as if we're not. We have to start to understand the level of assumed knowledge that we are assuming, and assumed knowledge that we have is different. And the way that we speak to people and the language we use has to be really tailored to someone not understanding anything about the specifics of the React core library, anything about the specifics of how JavaScript compiles down, anything about how the browser renders it. We just have to assume that we're all just developers. We have to assume that we're all just humans, just trying to get home, just trying to have a good day at work. And this is very difficult because everything is on fire all the time with the front-end community. This is just a whole bunch of stuff, and it's all moving very fast. And there's no real best practices, as we've just spoken about. The build tooling is still very complicated, but I'm not very good at build tooling. And the thing that's most interesting to me here is the front guy, is that we have to think as someone who is designing pixel-perfect user experiences and thinking about these really cool animations and thinking about how we create these experiences. And then I hand that off to myself and I have to make it. And that's not a very enjoyable process, because often you want to make things that are different to what might be possible or what you might be capable of making. So we have to really separate out those two parts of ourselves, the kind of implementer, the doer, and the dreamer, the hoper, when you're making your privacy-enhancing technology. So group discussions that I'm glad that we had. These are discussions that we had quite near the beginning that instigated very consciously and very purposefully, and I got my team in a room, and we just had at these ideas, and a great time was had by me, but not by the rest of the team. So how are we going to structure this application? React, I'm going to say it again for people in the back, React is a UI library, not a framework. So you've got to have a lot of understanding around your team and how everything is going to be structured. Where is your state? How are you accessing your API? How are you accessing your styling? Are you going to have like a storybook style situation, which I would recommend? How is all that going to fit together, and what do you need? How are we going to handle back and front development being out of sync? There will become a time where your backend developers will promise you something and it won't get delivered immediately, which is outrageous. So you're going to have some kind of mocking in place to get the data that you need to make the fantastic user interface that you want to make. So you need to be aware that that is going to happen. It might just happen once. For us, it was a very rare occurrence and very low cost occurrence, but I'm really glad that we understood that it would happen and kind of prepared for it. How are we going to handle a managed state? So what is local versus application level? Do we want to bring the reducer pattern into it? I don't, some people do, but be aware that it's all an option. And what styling architecture works for you? This is perhaps the most inflammatory thing you can say about to a room full of React developers. But should we be using CSS and JS, or should we be using like a CSS build chain, like SCSS, for example? Longer form discussions. So these are discussions that we had over a period of time. It wasn't like a sit down, get in a room, decide on something, we'll talk about it if it doesn't work. These were things that over the course of sort of 6 months we really kind of refined our opinions of. So when is it right to bring a third-party package versus when do we just roll our own? How do we integrate and how do we interact with client-side and server-side work? So that speaks for both us as developers, but also the communication between those two. In software, the hardest thing is always the boundary between two systems, right? So how does our front-end stuff talk to our server-side stuff, et cetera, et cetera? And the coding and linting standards. So coding and linting standards are there to help you and to serve you and your team directly. If you're getting to a place where you're having to alphabetically order your imports to a file for literally no reason, just take it out. You don't need to do it. You're not a slave to a machine to order your inputs alphabetically. We will have better things to do with our time than that. Refine it, please. Last thing, I promise, before we get onto some actual pragmatic stuff, and then I'll leave you alone. We want to look at having productive conversations. So I find the best way to kind of communicate, especially with backend developers. So these are people who've been working in software development for 5-10 years already. They understand code. If I bring in code and I send them code before, and in the meeting we talk about the code and we look at it and we understand what it looks like, it becomes less of a philosophical conversation and more of a developer experience conversation, which is really important. Always find the common ground. We're all intelligent people. We're all able to learn something. That's why we're all developers. You have to have an intrinsic ability to learn, and you do. People have that. Never underestimate it. Be clear about the decision you're making and how urgent it is. If something is like a 1 out of 10, don't worry about getting a meeting. Sometimes like 7 or 8s pop up, and you want to get everyone in a room that day to talk about how urgent it is, and we need to make a decision. And always be sure to present alternatives, even if you think the alternatives are literally the worst thing to ever happen to JavaScript. There are a couple of resources I keep recommending to people. Only when they ask. I don't just recommend these to people. I should just start accosting people on the street with Twitter handles. So if people are asking for people to follow and newsletters and websites to go to, this is the most pragmatic advice I can offer. The ReactJS official docs are fantastic. Go to them. Just read the basic section, front to top to bottom. You'll learn something. There's an advanced section. Go to it. Cannot recommend enough. Dan Abramov, back on Twitter now. Thank you. Is fantastic, very well spoken, very eloquent, very able to explain his ideas in the direction of the React community. Alex Biddle and Yves Porcello are fantastic role models within the React community. They're on a podcast called the Ladybug Podcast. Go listen to it, they're fantastic. Wes Boss and Scott Tolinsky do a podcast. They've got websites and courses, and Kent C. Dodds is just a swell fella. These are all people that provide well-informed, more considered opinions on the React community and provide generally best practice. So Kent C. Dodds did like the React testing library and all that stuff. So they know what they're talking about. They're here for the betterment of us all. I promise. You won't regret following them. Privitar are hiring. If you're interested about working for privacy-enhancing technologies and our front-end work, come and speak to me. If not, don't worry about it. I'll leave that on there. That's probably more important. That's more pragmatic to you all. That's it. That's my talk. That's everything I had to say. I said it all. Thanks, guys.